Hello, this is a homily for the fourth Sunday of Easter. The theme of these readings is summed up in that beautiful text that comes from Psalm 118. The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The theme in each case is picked up first of all in Acts, which actually uses the same quote. Then in the second reading, the world does not know us because it did not know him. Finally, we have the beautiful teaching by Jesus himself on the fact that he is the good shepherd. And we'll develop that in a little while. But first of all, this theme explains how the world is hostile. And we should know that already from the events of Good Friday. But the hostility is brought down not just to the leaders of the people and the elders, as I mentioned in the first reading, reading from Acts, but also a very strong reminder that we can slip into that kind of mindset. We can have what another psalm calls the proud man's disdain. And this can creep into many areas of life. Something I'm working on at the moment is the way in which John Paul II tried to rework universities so that they would use better philosophies than they were using. They quite often, most often in fact, choose to use man-made philosophies that really have nothing to do with God, and in fact usually are very hostile to God. And these philosophies are calmly brought in to the subject matter, and everything is handled through the lens of this hostile philosophy. That's just one example, and you can see how John Paul deals with that in Ex Corde Ecclesiae. But in fact, we can be hostile to what God is doing in so many ways. We can take from the world because the world just looks as if it knows more than the church does. We can take from, as I said, philosophers or entertainers or whoever, ways of thinking that are totally contrary to the way that God thinks and the way that God has made creation work and how God's church works. And so we find this theme coming up right from the beginning, where Peter addresses the leaders of the people and the elders. Peter is on trial with his followers, and he's challenging the elders and saying, you should know that it was in the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead. In his name this man stands before you healed. In a nutshell, he has shown these power figures in the culture, in this case the religious culture, that in fact there's something bigger than what they can handle here. And by them trying to cut down to size this Christian phenomenon, they are in fact going to fail. And we see this happening in various socialist countries where the church is really on the chopping block because the government is trying to cut the church down to size, something that it can manage. And yet, this is a phenomenon, Catholicism, which is centered on the God-made man. So really and truly, any earthly government is going to look rather pathetic. But let's not just project that onto the government, but also say that we can make Catholicism look weak if we are not paying attention to the wonder that is Jesus Christ. So then Peter uses this line, he is the stone. As I said, this is the line from Psalm 118. He is the stone rejected by you, the builders, talking now to the elders and the chief priests and so on. And basically, they are the ones who build the culture. They were the ones who were sustaining the proper meaning of the Jewish faith. And yet they couldn't see that the Messiah had come. Moving on then, Peter says, there is no other name under heaven by which we are to be saved. So it's not a small issue that's being negotiated here. It is something that is spectacularly important. We can't overemphasize the meaning of the salvation of humanity and our individual salvation. And we don't want to play with power figures like religious leaders, governments, commercial enterprises, when we're trying to deal with our salvation and appropriate what Christ has done for us. The psalm then has an antiphon which comes straight from the psalm. The stone rejected by the builders has become the cornerstone. Obviously, we have to appreciate the meaning of cornerstone, that it is the cornerstone of this whole artifice that God has created. And in the midst of that, we live, and this cornerstone, Jesus Christ, gives meaning to the whole arch, which has been constructed by the will of God. It is better, the psalmist says, to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It's just putting exactly what we said in different terms. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. Moving on from the psalm, then, we come to the second reading, which is a piece of 1 John 3. And John is writing to his community, see what love the Father has bestowed on us. This is how great this work of God is, that we may be called the children of God. Here we get again to this theme of rejection. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. We know that when it is all revealed what God is doing, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. This is the glorious culmination of salvation. And that's really worth something. We cannot sacrifice that glorious salvation for the trivialities of what an anti-religious government thinks, what an anti-religious political party thinks. None of these people's approval is worth sacrificing this glorious vision of being children of God. Then the key changes, and we get into John chapter 10, where Jesus explains the notion of the Good Shepherd. Now, on the one hand, there is the notion of the shepherd who is good, and consequently one who will lay down his life for his sheep. We know what that means. We've just been through the experience of Good Friday. Jesus says he is not the hired hand who would leave the sheep and run away. Jesus is again setting this contrast with false leaders of the sheep. When the wolf comes, this hired hand leaves the sheep and runs away. And this is because he works for pay and has no concern for the sheep. And now we play the theme of concern. The shepherd is good because he knows his sheep and his sheep know him. Just as this knowing is very, if you like, terrestrial at this level, just as Jesus then expands the metaphor as the Father knows me and I know the Father. So we have this identification between Jesus and the Father, where he is deeply bonded to the Father and he's deeply bonded to us as well. Of course, we will discover all of that means in looking at the incarnation, what it means for Jesus as the divine Son to take on human nature. But Jesus goes further. He must go on and find the other sheep who do not belong to this fold. These also I must lead, and they will hear my voice, and here's the crunch, there will be one flock and one shepherd. There is to be a unifying of the human race in its love of God and its love for one another, so that the whole of the human race has salvation. And that is, if you like, where these readings leave us. We have on the one hand the theme of how the world generally rejects and is hostile to Catholicism, and on the other hand we have this beautiful vision of salvation which comes from a unified flock being loved and cared for by the shepherd, who will even go to the point of laying down his life for his sheep. If he does that, can we do any less? Have a nice day.